Welcome to Table Talk here at the Philadelphia Sports Table Podcast Show, the longest running weekly Philly sports podcast show in the world. That's right, 12 years strong, and we got a great guest this week on our interview show. And I got to tell you, folks, we've seen him and spoken to him a number of times over the years as it pertains to college football prospects, NFL talk, and news. But we're not doing that, folks, this week with this particular gentleman here. We are finally going to dive into some Formula One. That's right, some F1 talk here at the Philadelphia Sports Table Podcast Show. We've got our good buddy who writes for SB Nation, Mark Schofield. How you doing, Mark?
I'm doing well, Jeff. It is fantastic to be here. I'm really excited about today's show because I get to take the NFL football hat off and put the Formula One hat on, which I do enjoy doing. It's been fun to dive into this world over the past couple of years. As we're going to talk about, I was down in Miami all last week for the Miami Grand Prix. And so it's been a fun F1 season so far. It's been fun diving into the sport, and I'm excited to chop it up with you about it.
Sounds good. Mark, I know you're over on Blue Sky, I think. You're also on Threads as well. Again, sbnation.com, folks, head to F1, and you're going to be able to find a lot of Mark's material there. But where can folks find you on the interwebs out there if they want to follow you?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, sbnation.com is the way to find all the pieces. But yeah, with social media sort of splintering and fracturing the way it has over the past couple of years, I've been, finding some new spots. So it's Mark Schofield 3916 on Threads, and then Mark Schofield on Blue Sky. That's where I do most of the stuff now. I pretty much cross post between the two. So if you're on one or the other, that's where you'll be able to find me.
All right, very good. Well, let's get into some F1 talk right here. And again, like I mentioned, we haven't dove into F1 talk here at the Philadelphia Sports Table Podcast Show, so our listeners may not necessarily be, quote, up to speed on what Formula One really is, where it came from. And I think, when we look at the history of Formula One racing, Mark, we can, we look back to the 1920s, 1930s over in Europe where it really started. And then it came over here to the U.S. in about 1959, where some folks witnessed for the very first time what F1 was at the United States Grand Prix, which was held in Florida. It began evolving more and more, gaining popularity over the years and decades. But I feel like there was an F1 surge within the past 10 years or so. I could be wrong with that, but I'm wondering if you can kind of take us through, when did that surge of F1 really start happening in our contemporary history here? And why do you think it moved to another level and echelon within the sports world?
Yeah, and look, you can ask anybody this sort of question that's in the F1 world, and the first thing they'll bring up is Drive to Survive. The Netflix docuseries, which debuted a couple of years ago, really sort of caught fire, I'd say, during COVID. If you think back during COVID, when people were sort of under lockdown, looking for things to do, Tiger King, Animal Crossing, those were some of the docuseries, video games that people started to play a lot. Drive to Survive was in like its third season, during COVID, but people sort of dove into it and liked what they saw. And while the Netflix docuseries Drive to Survive is heavily, I'd say, dramatized, they do some creative editing. For example, they play up things, rivalries, emotions that maybe aren't as heightened as they seem in the show. What the series did was really reintroduce old fans, new fans, curious fans to the personalities.
Yeah.
And as we get into this social media era, as we get deeper into this social media era, learning about the personalities, the people, the drivers under the helmet, the team principals, the men and women behind the scenes, the men and women trying to get on the grid, that's hooked people in, and it's converted a lot of casual race car fans, casual F1 fans into more hardcore fans. And so I think, you talk to a lot of people, they'll say, first, the main thing is Drive to Survive. But I also think that the teams themselves, and to a certain extent, the athletes themselves, have realized their marketability. And let's face it, Formula One, like you walk into the paddock on Sunday at race day, whether it's Miami, Austin, wherever, it's late stage capitalism. Like there are brands everywhere, there are activations everywhere.
Yeah.
There is a lot of money at a Formula One track. with good reason. Sponsors pay a lot of money. They want to be associated with world famous drivers. It's a glamorous lifestyle that they're trying to sell to potential customers. And the drivers themselves are a big part of that. And so whether it's their own social media, teams, the teams themselves, for example, last year, Sauber, dead last on the grid, had a very slow car. Valtteri Bottas and Zhou Yu, neither one of them have a full-time seat right now, but their social media team did such a great job that their sponsors were still happy with what they were seeing. And so they've marketed the drivers extremely well, which again creates that connection between drivers and potential fans or new fans. So I think the social media aspect of it and the accessibility of the sport and the willingness of F1 teams and F1 themselves to open the doors to smaller content creators and things like that has certainly helped. And we're going to see something else, Jeff, over this summer. And that's the F1 movie. We're recording this on Monday
Oh
morning.
yeah.
They just released the final theatrical trailer. You've got a movie starring Brad Pitt and Javier Bardem. You've got a movie produced by Jerry Bruckheimer and Lewis Hamilton. They have gone all out for this. I mean, they were filming during race weekends, with that car that they built up against Verstappen and Leclerc and drivers on the grid. I mean, you see this trailer and it's basically like Top Gun Maverick on an F1 track. And they've put a lot behind it. In Miami, they had in the paddock a fictional garage where they released the soundtrack. You could walk through the garage, you could stand on a podium. They made little trading cards. I've got one of myself where it's got a chip in it. You put it next to your phone and the soundtrack pops up on your phone. They had the
That's
actual
awesome.
APXGP F1 car that they built for the movie just sitting there in the paddock. And so
Yeah.
I think this F1 movie as well is going to, again, kick this further into gear. And now we've got 3 races here in the States. We've got Miami, we've got Austin, which is the longest running race on the calendar. And now you've got Las Vegas, which just debuted a few seasons ago. Italy has 2. We've got 3.
Yeah.
That tells you how critical the US market is to F1 themselves. And in Miami, they announced an extension of the current contract for the Miami Grand Prix through 2041. Like, you
Wow.
had the press in the press conference room with Tom Garfinkel, the managing partner of the Miami Grand Prix, and Stefano Domenicali, the president and CEO of F1. We were all asking ourselves, we might not be here. That's a long extension, but that tells you the commitment of this sport to F1 here in the United States.
It really is amazing. You talk about personalities too, and I find it so astonishing, and it's such an eye-opening aspect of the sports world in general, where personalities drive so much of our interest in the world of sports. Mark, I mean, you and I've talked football for so many years. Look what just happened with Shador Sanders and the storylines with him based on personality. The Sanders family, that personality of who they are and what they are. Let's move to the Philadelphia Eagles. Jalen Hurts, his personality, the narratives that come from that. In Philly, Bryce Harper, the what he has done with the Phillies, his personality and what comes with that. It really is amazing to me how personality drives so much, excuse the pun,
Right.
drives so much of how we like to really consume sports in general. It really is quite astonishing.
Yeah, I mean, it's a personality-driven world at this point. I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah.
for example, my pathway to Formula One. I grew up in the Boston area. You can hear the accent. I was a team sports kid growing up: Red Sox, Bruins, Celtics,
Yeah.
Patriots. Then I go to college and get more access to the internet. You get more access to ESPN around the clock, and I'm hearing things about Benetton, and I'm like, that's a sweatshirt company. You mean
Right.
it's a team? And then that introduces me to Michael Schumacher, and instantly I'm hooked. I'm fascinated by this. And
Right.
then Michael Schumacher got me in the door. Lewis Hamilton made me stick for this sport, and so the personalities really sort of drive it. And I've said this before, Jeff. F1 drivers are just built differently. Their race car drivers are built differently. The men and women that do this, that climb into the cars, are different. And here's a quick story to that. Um, when I was in Miami last year in 24, I sat down with Jack Doohan, who last year was a reserve driver at Alpine. He started this year as a full-time driver, but was just demoted after Miami. They're letting another driver sit in his seat for at least 5 races to see what he can do. And Alpine's an interesting story because in the past 2 years, they've gotten a lot of famous investors buying in. Patrick Mahomes, Travis Kelsey, Michael B. Jordan, Rory McIlroy. And so I thought it was a throwaway question, Jeff. I asked him, when these new investors were announced, who are you most excited to meet, Jack? And he looked at me and he said, Anthony Joshua. Anthony Joshua, former heavyweight champion, British boxer.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, why him? He said, well, he gets in the ring and he puts it all on the line. One punch and it could be over. It could be done. He could be dead. And that's what we do. We climb in the car. We put it all on the line. We go into the corner. We're trying to be the last to break. We're doing it at 240 miles an hour. We've made the sport safer, but it's not ever going to be completely safe. You have to be willing to die. And I literally choked up at the moment.
Yeah.
But that's what they live with. That's what they do. And they're just, like I said, they're built differently. And then when you could take somebody like that and then see them, selling sweatshirts, selling apparel, selling yachts, selling whatever, like those are fascinating personalities to get to know. And that connection with them drives this sport's popularity all over the world.
It really is amazing. You said they're built differently. Look, they absolutely are. I would never do it. I don't want to die, Mark. I
Right.
don't want to
And
die.
it's interesting.
Gosh.
Another quick story. This is more
Yeah.
IndyCar than F1, but there's obviously a lot of overlap. Last week, I interviewed Nolan Siegel, who's 20 years old. He drives for Arrow McLaren in their IndyCar team. They've got the Indianapolis 500 coming up later this month. One of, if not the biggest racing event in the entire world, right? Now, last year, he was a part-time driver. He was trying to qualify for the Indianapolis 500. He was in what's called last chance qualifying. It's the final portion of qualifying where the drivers at the bottom of the table are fighting for those final spots. He was the last driver to go. He had already had a really bad crash in practice that week. And he told his team, look, I'm either putting this car in the wall or on the grid. And he had a really bad accident. But asking him about it, he's like, look, that's what you have to do. That's the job. That's what we do. That's what you sign up for. Like, yes, when you're going 245 and you've got a brick wall that you're going towards and you have to turn, it can get scary.
Yeah.
I interviewed Alexander Rossi, who won the 16 Indianapolis 500 as a rookie. And I asked him, first question, what is 245, into a corner at Indianapolis sound and feel like? And he's like, it's scary. It's honestly scary. But that's what we do and that's what we love. They're absolutely built differently, and their willingness to put it all on the line, hats off to them, man.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, as we're moving along with the conversation here, Mark, I really wanted to talk about the technology that is involved with F1 because in recent years, I mean, the sport has seen a number of changes. And I'm hoping we could dive into some of them here to give some more information and context about F1 to our listeners. Significant advances in technology like hybrid engines and ground effect aerodynamics have really been at the forefront of F1 trends. I'm wondering if you can talk about these tech trends in more detail and why they're so important to F1 as a sport.
Well, technological advancements get to the heart of Formula One as a sport.
Yeah.
And in many ways, F1 is as much a race to be won by the drivers as it is an engineering riddle to be solved by the team's engineers and developers at the factory. And let's put it, since you and I have spent so much time talking football over the years, let's put it into this sort of analogy here. Imagine if Roger Goodell came out today and said, started in 2027, passing touchdowns are worth 10 points, not 6. Field goals over 50 yards are worth 5 points, not 3. You're going to change things as a team, right?
Right.
You're going to up your passing game. You're going to go out and find a big-legged kicker, right? Well, Formula One does that every few years. They rewrite the technical regulations. And so nothing is static. Things change all the time. Starting next year, we have a whole new set of technical regulations that are going to go into effect, where you're going to have movable aerodynamics in both the front and the rear wings. They're going to open and close at various points throughout the lap at a given circuit. So you can get either less drag or more downforce and an ability to turn better in the corners. You're going to get a 50-50 split on the power units between the internal combustion engine and the battery hybrid portion of the engine. You're going to be running these cars on 100% fully sustainable fuels. And you're going to have lighter cars. They're going to be 30 kilograms as of right now, lighter than the current iteration, the current generations of cars. And they do this every couple of years. I mean, we had new regulations go into effect in 22. Now we're getting them in 26. And so they rewrite everything. And the reason for that is it's to encourage technological development, not just in the sport, but on the road. You know, when you've got a manufacturer like Ford, for example, they're joining as a power unit manufacturer next year in a partnership with Red Bull. Red Bull have been with Honda for years. They power
Yeah.
Verstappen's wins and everything. Now you've got Red Bull and Ford in this new partnership because Ford's thinking, you know, if we can build a power unit that accounts for 50% of the power for an F1 car from the battery, we can work with that on our road cars.
Yeah.
You know, if
Yeah.
you're running cars, you're developing power units that are running on 100% sustainable fuels, that's something you can take to the road. You know, that's why you've got Audi next year joining as an engine manufacturer, or power unit manufacturer. Cadillac is going to be the 11th team on the grid. Now, they're going to be a customer of Ferrari, so they'll have Ferrari power units to start, but they're going to have their own power unit started in, I believe, 29. And they want to be a part of this because the technological advancements that are pushed forward by F1 and their new regulations, you can translate those advancements and what you learn from that process to your road cars as a manufacturer. And so technological advancements are a huge part of this sport. And again, they rewrite everything every couple of years, which is why, and I'll dive into this in a few minutes, but teams are facing a fascinating choice right now because of the cost cap, a budget cap, where you can only
Right.
spend so much money. You can only
Yep.
do so much each year, you know, in terms of development of the car in season. Teams are looking at the way things are right now. And a lot of teams have decided, you know what? We're probably going to focus now on 26 because if you can get a leg up, like when F1 went to the turbocharged era, Mercedes dominated, you know, because they got a leg up in, you know, that first year under those regulations. Mercedes went in a wildly different direction under the current set of regulations. They tried that zero pod configuration to their chassis. It didn't work. And Red Bull, you know, dominated this last era up until last season. And so they rewrite the record book. It's an engineering problem that these teams have to solve. And if I can make one recommendation, this book right here, How to Build a Car by Adrian Newey. Okay. One of the greatest engineers and designers in the sport's history. It was massive news last year in Miami when the announcement came. He was leaving Red Bull for Aston Martin. He just started in March talking with Fernando Alonso down in Miami 2 weeks ago. And they basically said Adrian Newey is laser focused on 26. They're a customer, you know, right now of Mercedes, but they're going to have their own power unit. But there's a belief that, hey, if Newey gets it right, Aston Martin could be dominant in the next era of regulations. And so technological development and advancements, it's at the heart of this sport. And it's really what this sport is all about.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, we talk about the trends and how trends in sports and here with our discussion with F1 continue to change over time. And another trend that we have seen more and more in terms of intensifying over the years is just rivalries, Mark. I mean, whether it's Mercedes versus Red Bull, you know, one of the defining rivalries of this era, is so interesting to watch and to even learn about here. So I know this is an elementary type of question, but how do these rivalries really start and sustain themselves in F1? And I would imagine it does enhance the F1 experience.
Yeah, I mean, look, rivalries tend to enhance sports, right? I mean, whether
Exactly.
it's
Yeah.
Penn State, Ohio State, whether it's, you know, Eagles, Commanders,
Yeah.
Yankees, Red Sox, like rivalries tend to, you know, spur excitement, generate controversy, you know, get people's attention. Historically in F1, though, rivalries have been amongst drivers, right? Like, you know, sometimes it's drivers on opposite teams, you know, Senna versus Prost, you know, Nicky Lauda versus James Hunt, which was the inspiration for the movie Rush. You know, you had James Hunt, this international playboy that, you know, liked to live the lifestyle away from the track as much as he did on the track. Whereas you had Nicky Lauda, this Austrian that was basically a robot that
Yeah.
like lived, ate, slept, driving a race car. Two wildly different people that were rivals on the track, but grew to have a genuine connection and friendship because of what they went through. So historically, it's been drivers. What's been interesting with Red Bull and Mercedes, and while there was a Hamilton versus Verstappen, we all know what happened in 21. A championship between those two that went down to the final corners and ended in controversial fashion.
Right.
There is a bit of a team principal rivalry between Toto Wolff, the team principal at Mercedes, and Christian Horner, the team principal at Red Bull. They respect each other. They certainly respect each other's accomplishments. I mean, they're two of the longest tenured team principals in the history of the sport. Wolff has won a ton of championships at Mercedes, drivers' championships with Hamilton. Horner's won, drivers' championships, constructors' championships with Red Bull. They respect each other, but they love nothing more than to needle each other.
Yeah.
And I think I don't want to say a genuine dislike, but I think there's an enjoyment that they get out of poking and prodding and trying to provoke the other. I mean, for
Right.
example, team principal's press conference in Miami, on Friday, a couple weeks ago, Wolf walks in. He's got this weird t-shirt and white jeans on. He's not wearing the usual Mercedes get up. He's wearing something a little different, something a little special that the team was doing for one of their activations in Miami. And Horner, who's there in the Red Bull shirt and button down and slacks, he looks at him. He says, "Is this some sort of midlife crisis?" These are the kind of things they say to each other. When there was all the controversy last year about Christian Horner being investigated for potential sexual misconduct with a subordinate at Red Bull, and there were rumors about whether Verstappen was happy at Red Bull, Toto Wolff did not hide his intentions of potentially signing Max Verstappen away. He talked about it anytime he was close to a microphone because it was a way to get under Horner's skin. And now you're seeing it with McLaren CEO Zach Brown, who, if you watch Drive to Survive from last season, talks about how, we'll see if we can push Horner to the breaking point. And Horner on camera looks into the camera and says, straight faced, Zach Brown's a prick. These team principals are getting involved as well
Right.
with some of the personality stuff. They like needling each other when they can. And so I think that's fed into a bit of a Merc versus Red Bull type of rivalry where you've got Wolff and Horner poking and prodding each other any way they can through the media.
All right, very good. Again, folks, we're talking to Mark Schofield from SB Nation. Head on over to sbnation.com or just search out Mark on various social sites, specifically Blue Sky and Threads. We are going to take just a quick break, folks, and we're going to be back in just a bit. Stick with us. All right, we are back again. We got Mark Schofield from sbnation.com. Search him out on Threads and also over on Blue Sky. He's a great follow as we're diving into F1 here. And Mark, you mentioned that you were in Miami last week for the Miami Grand Prix. Oscar Piastri. Oh my gosh, dear Lord, Oscar Piastri. He won the Miami Grand Prix. It really strengthened his lead within the World Championships. It was his fourth victory this season. What kind of history is Piastri making here in 2025? And how should we be looking at his season?
Well, I mean, the short answer is none yet.
Okay.
I mean, we are a couple of years removed from in 23, there were 23 races because Imola was canceled that year due to flooding. And Max Verstappen won 19 races that year.
Yeah.
I mean, Checo Perez won 2. So you had Red Bull winning all but one race. And then Carlos Sainz Jr. won in Singapore when he was driving for Ferrari. Now he's with Williams. So, Piastri's won 4 of 6. That's very good. But we're not close to the kind of dominance that we saw from Verstappen that year. And what's really interesting about what's happening with McLaren right now, and I know we're going to talk about them in a minute, but they have 2 very good drivers, 2 extremely good drivers in Oscar Piastri and Lando Norris. And what's interesting about that is, they've set their team up where they have like a 1A and a 1B or 2 number 1 drivers, whereas Red Bull historically has always had like a preferred driver. Now it's Verstappen and somebody that they look to as somebody that can help out and help Max when they can, and make sure the team can contend for a constructor's title. So it'll be interesting as we get deeper into the season if, Lando and Oscar end up taking points off of each other, which perhaps keeps Verstappen in striking range of a driver's championship in a way that happened last year, McLaren certainly they brought an upgrade package to Miami, and they were lights out for the most part since then. But you had Lando winning some races, you had Oscar winning some races, you had Verstappen winning when he could, and it was enough for Verstappen to win the drivers, even though McLaren won the constructors championship with Ferrari second. And so you wonder when we start thinking about the drivers, Oscar has that 16-point lead now over Lando, but will they continue to take points off of each other and leave the door open for a Max Verstappen, to win another driver's title, even though McLaren seems to be running away from things.
Right.
Now,
Right.
with respect to Oscar specifically, he's Iceman. I know that nickname has already been taken here in the sport of F1,
Right.
but you can talk to him after he wins a race. You can talk to him after he finishes P19, and it's the same human being. Like, there is no highs, there are no lows. He's completely even keeled. And what's been interesting with Piastri versus Verstappen, as opposed to Norris versus Verstappen, Oscar knows how to race Max. Max, one of the most enduring moments from last F1 season for me, Jeff, was in Austin. Lando and Max had another battle in that race. There was a penalty handed out, and, neither one of them won. And it was in a moment where Lando was trying everything he could to get close enough to Max to potentially win the driver's title. And Max really got his elbows out in that race. And speaking with Lando after that race, you could see in his face, Lando is a very, very open, very honest, very self-critical human being, very self-critical athlete. And I've spoken with him on multiple occasions now. And he doesn't hold his opinions back.
Yeah.
Some people say he's almost too open
Yeah.
with his, self-awareness, with his struggles with mental health. He's been very open about that, which I commend him for personally. And I could see that afternoon, that Sunday in Austin, Jeff, the realization in Lando's eyes that if he wants to beat Max, he has to do what we talked about and be willing to literally put it all out on a line. Because Max Verstappen is going to race you hard. He's going to push the limits of the rule book. And Lando has struggled over the past, say, year and a half at realizing just what it takes to pass and overtake Max on the track. Oscar has shown no fear. None whatsoever. He will push the limits right back on Max Verstappen. There has been already a penalty incident between the two, with Max going off track against Oscar to try to maintain the lead, and Verstappen getting a 5-second penalty for overtaking off of the track and opening the door for Oscar to win a race. And so it's been fascinating to see that willingness already at this point of his young career from Oscar to push the limits, to do what it takes to fight with Verstappen. And, will that continue? Will Max have counters? Will Lando finally, be willing to do some of those things as well? He talked about after Miami, like he wasn't willing to sort of risk his entire race and crash with Max to give up what at that point was probably just going to be a P2 with the way Oscar had gotten out in front. At some point, you might see Lando be a bit more willing to get the elbows out as well. And so I think that's going to be, an interesting dynamic to watch over the rest of the season.
Absolutely. Oscar is going to be fascinating to watch for the rest of this season and to, see where he goes. And again, looking probably at where he is going to be etched in stone, perhaps in the future in terms of F1 history. This season is going to give him perhaps a foundation for that. But moving along here, Mark, after Miami and you being down there, you wrote on SB Nation about how McLaren has really taken things to the next level from where they were at coming into the Miami Grand Prix in 2024 last year to where they are now after this 2025 Miami Grand Prix. They're no longer the underdogs. Everyone is basically chasing them at this moment. How and why do you think we've seen this type of growth from McLaren, as their confidence has certainly been boosted this year? What are your thoughts here?
I might go for like 30 minutes here, honestly,
We may need
because
another
this is a
break then.
fascinating
No.
story to me. And I've basically had a front row view of it.
You
I
have, yes.
remember, Jeff, my first driver exclusive was with Lando before Azerbaijan in 23. They had gotten out, he and Oscar, they were dead last on the grid in the season opening Bahrain Grand Prix. Like, Oscar had to retire for a hydraulics issue, I believe. Lando had, or, he had an issue with his car. Lando had to pit multiple times to manage an issue he was having. They finished dead last, the two of them. And Azerbaijan was early in the year that season. And I asked Lando, where they were. And he basically said, we're fighting for points.
Yeah.
Top 10 finishers get points. He's like, we're fighting for points right now. Forget podiums, forget wins. We're fighting for points. And 23 was the year that, they, that Red Bull sort of ran away with things. But McLaren started to improve over the course of that season. They eventually came from the back of the grid to finish fourth, which was a bit of a surprise. And I interviewed Zach Brown, their CEO, before the Las Vegas Grand Prix that year. And I asked him, like, what was leading to that? And he said, faster race car. Like, they improved the race car. They improved the team, the management structure with Andrea Stella as the team principal and some of the technological minds around, so they could improve that car, which was that year the MCL 60, which was a nod to their 60th year in motorsport. And so the technological improvements of the car that year certainly helped. But as Zach told me, and he told me this that year, they're the best driver duo on the grid. And he certainly said, look, Verstappen's great. And he looked at, George Russell and Lewis Hamilton, who were together at Mercedes. They're like, look, they're great too. But these are two young, fast drivers that both want to be world champions. And this was Oscar's rookie year in 23. And he said, what I love about Oscar is a lot of young drivers get into the first practice session on a Friday. They try to win the race on Friday and they end up making mistakes. And it's a downward spiral from there. And they can't get to where they need to be by the time the lights go out on Sunday. Oscar builds it up throughout the weekend where he'll be okay in FP1, better in FP2. By the time FP3 and qualifying roll around, he's where he needs to be.
Yeah.
That maturity from a young driver really sort of stood out to him. And so, that was 23. Then last year, they brought that upgrade package to Miami. Lando wins his first race. He sheds the Lando no-wins moniker. And suddenly they're off like a rocket. Had a great year last year. They win the Constructors title. Now let's get to this year. They're now entering the year favorites. Lando is the preseason drivers champion favorite. Right now, we've got Oscar in the lead in that fight. What they've really done this year, Jeff, and it was a huge talking point in Miami, while every other team is struggling with their rear tires overheating, theirs aren't. And people are wondering how they're doing it. Now, a couple of drivers in some heated post-race frustration might say, they're cheating, they're doing something wrong.
Right.
Other team principals, Christian Horner and Toto Wolff, basically saying, we don't know what they're doing, but they've got it absolutely right. And we got to figure out what they're doing. Andrea Stella in the McLaren hospitality space after the race gave a ton of credit to his engineers, basically saying, look, they figured something out here. Obviously, he's not going to say what it is.
Right.
But their tires are not overheating. Whereas you look at Ferrari, you look at Mercedes, you look at Red Bull, you get 10, 12, 13 laps into a stint on a set of tires, their rears are gone. And Horner even said, look, I've got thermal imaging that will show their tires are cooler than everybody else's. I don't know how they're doing it, but they're doing it. And so that's been a big part. The technological, again, that phrase, it's an engineering riddle to be solved.
Yeah.
McLaren has solved that portion of the riddle. Now, there is something interesting coming later this month at Barcelona, the Spanish Grand Prix, flexi wings, right? The flexible front wing, that's been a big talking point. Last year, there were some mid-season, late-season restrictions put in because people noticed on film that McLaren's wing flaps were expanding a little bit more, which gave them that sort of mini DRS. Drag reduction system is an element on this generation's cars where on certain portions at certain tracks, you press a button, that rear wing opens up a big flap, gives you more speed. You can only do it if you're within a second of the car in front of you. Well, they were getting what they call the mini DRS effect with that wind flex and under aerodynamic load opens up a little bit more of a gap in the wings, a little bit less downforce, less drag, more speed on straights. So the FIA sort of tightened that up a bit, but they're going to have even more testing on those wings done, start at the Spanish Grand Prix later this month. People have said, Red Bull has said that might bring McLaren a little bit closer back to the field. McLaren has denied it, said, look, everything's been legal. We're going to get on Wednesday the post-race inspections on Piastri's car from Miami. Everything's expected to be still legal and, within regulations. But is this just Christian Horner and company sort of needling Zach Brown? Is there something actually to be worried about if you're McLaren? I don't know. But they have come so far over these past couple of years. And frankly, over my coverage of this sport, it's been fascinating personally to watch because, again, sit down with Lando in Azerbaijan in 23, and he's like, we're fighting for points. Now they're
Yeah.
fighting for wins. Now they're
Yeah.
fighting for titles. They're winning a championship or two. And so it's been fascinating to watch. They've got two very fast drivers, but they've also got a lot of the technological developments right over the past year and a half. One last thing I'll say, and I told you I was going to go on here. Upgrades. We might be at a tipping point here with upgrades because, I talked to Gunther Steiner, former Haas team principal, face of Drive to Survive, before this year began. And he said May into June might be the tipping point for teams turning the page to 26. Because with the budget cap, with the cost cap, with the idea that you could get ahead of the field starting next year with the new regulations, teams that aren't in the title fight may wave their hands and say, you know what?
Yeah.
We're done trying to improve this car.
Yeah.
We're moving to next year. Some teams I think have already done that. I mentioned Aston Martin. Fernando Alonso has basically said, look, Adrian Newey is focused on next year. Carlos Sainz was so excited being 3/10 off of pole position in Miami. But as he told us after qualifying, our team is focused on 26. Like they're probably not going to do too much more to improve this year's car. Red Bull, if Verstappen is still in the fight, might bring some more improvements. But we might get to a point where the rest of the grid just decides they're so far ahead right now, we're turning the page to 26. And maybe when all is said and done, we do this show in December, we're talking about a dominant season from McLaren, from Piastri or Norris, similar to what we saw from Verstappen and Red Bull in 23.
It's so interesting as to where this sport is going. It really is so very interesting. And Mark, buddy, before I let you go, I'd be remiss if we didn't talk about any under the radar athletes here that we should really be keeping our eyes on. I always ask our guests just about on every podcast, as our listeners will know, about under the radar athletes we really need to keep our eyes on. And I'm going to ask you the same here in terms of F1 drivers, in terms of any storylines that you have been following behind the scenes. Are there any athletes, some F1 drivers that we really should be looking at that you would deem under the radar here for this 2025 season?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first one, and I don't know if he's really under the radar for most sort of F1 fans, but for the more sort of casual or newer fans, Kimi Antonelli at Mercedes. Like, you're talking about an 18-year-old.
Yeah.
I mean, I coach a 16U travel baseball team, and I was down in Miami. I missed their tournament, but I was back at practice this week. We had a game last night, and I'm looking at kids that are just a few years removed from Kimi Antonelli,
Yeah.
who qualified on pole for the F1 sprint race in Miami, who stepped into a seat vacated by Lewis Hamilton, who is still studying for his school finals as
Right.
this is happening.
Jeez.
It's mind blowing. It's
Yeah.
absolutely mind blowing what he's accomplished already in the sport. But this year we saw a lot of new drivers on the grid, right? You had, Antonelli joining Mercedes. You had Oliver Bierman, stepping in at Haas. He had driven for Ferrari as a reserve and Haas as a reserve last year. Gabriel Bortoleto, coming over, the F2 champion from last year. He's driving for Sauber. They become Audi next year. You had Jack Doohan, who started the year at Alpine. Now you've got Franco Colapinto, who drove for Williams last year in a sub role when they benched Logan Sargent, did a great job for them. Now he's getting another shot in the Alpine. Isaac Hadjar, who's going to be my next name on this list.
Yeah.
I mean, qualified 11th for Miami, finished 11th in Miami. So just outside the points, just outside the top 10. And just the desire from him to win, like you could have told me in talking to him after both of those P11s that he had finished dead last, I would have believed it because he was that upset, like mad, frustrated, disappointed, like all of the above. I think he's going to be special. And if this is the first you're hearing the name Isaac Hadjar, Google 24 F2 Monaco Hadjar. You will see one of the most incredible moves in all of motorsport I've ever seen. The Monaco Grand Prix, there's a tunnel. All right. It's historic racetrack, one of the most glamorous races, part of the Triple Crown of racing. And during one of the F2 events, a car slowed along the right side in that tunnel along a curve. Hadjar comes up on him around a blind turn at like 200 miles an hour. In a split second, is able to avoid a collision. And it shows you the reflexes these men and women have in these cars. And so Hadjar and Antonelli certainly stand out to me. One name I'll throw out there. Remember, I mentioned it earlier. Cadillac is joining the grid as the 11th team. They wanted to be, from when they first announced it at the start of the 23 calendar year, they wanted to be an all American team, right? Colton Herta, who drives for Andretti, who's Andretti is part of this Cadillac team, drives for Andretti and IndyCar. He has been a name linked with a move to F1 for years. He
Yep.
was linked with Red Bull, but there was an issue where he didn't have enough points for his super license. He might be one of the next F1 drivers on the grid. And so he might be somebody to keep an eye on. If not him, another name, and I interviewed him recently, Pato O'Ward, drives for Arrow McLaren, one of the most dynamic, engaging personalities in all of motorsport right now. He's also been linked with a move to the F1 grid. You know, Cadillac said, look, we want an all American team. He's Mexican. That could be an all North American team as well. So Herta and O'Ward are two names outside F1 right now that people should keep an eye on.
Again, folks, he's Mark Schofield from SB Nation. Head on over to sbnation.com and search out all the F1 articles and content that SB Nation has. You're going to find Mark over there. Buddy, it was great talking to you. Thank you so much for joining us here on our Table Talk interview show this week. Let's talk again at some point down the road, my friend. Always a great time.
Always love it, Jeff. Always love coming on. Thanks for having me on. Thanks for letting me talk a little bit F1. As you can tell, I love talking NFL. I love talking quarterbacks and all that
Yeah.
good stuff, but I kind of like talking F1 too.
Absolutely. And we will have you on again, my friend, down the road. Folks, that's going to do it for us here. We're going to let Mark go, and we will see you next time.